The dog hit the doors at full speed. No handler, no leash. Just 80 pounds of Belgian Malinois muscle blowing past the security desk like the man behind it didn't exist. Claws skidding on polished linoleum, black nose working the air with the focus of something that had been looking for a very long time. Doctors flattened against the wall. A crash cart rolled sideways. One orderly dropped a tray of instruments and didn't bother picking them up. The dog didn't stop until it reached her. And then it sat, perfectly still, and laid a burned tactical armband at her feet like an offering. The hallway went dead quiet. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because the story you're about to hear is exactly the kind that keeps people up at night. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it started. Cascade Valley Medical Center sat at the edge of Redfield, Wyoming, in that specific way that buildings in small mountain cities sit, like they were placed there by someone who ran out of better ideas. The emergency wing faced a highway nobody used after dark, and the staff parking lot flooded every spring without fail. The hospital had 340 beds, an understaffed ICU, a cardiac unit that smelled faintly of mildew, and one chief physician who ran the entire operation like a man who'd never once been told no. Dr. Randall Voss had been chief for 11 years. That was 9 years longer than most of the nursing staff could explain without lowering their voices. He was not a bad surgeon, technically. He had the hands for it, steady, precise, unhurried. He also had the kind of institutional confidence that grows in people who are promoted too fast and corrected too rarely, and by the time Claire Navarro had arrived at Cascade Valley 3 years ago, Voss had already calcified into something that looked like authority from a distance and felt like something else up close. Claire had taken the job in January, in the middle of a storm that closed the mountain pass for 4 days and left Redfield briefly cut off from everything. She'd driven in from outside the state, requested the overnight shift, and introduced herself to the charge nurse with 2 sentences and a firm handshake. Her personnel file listed 11 years of nursing experience across 2 hospital systems. It didn't list anything else. She was 36, quiet, competent in ways that didn't announce themselves. She wore her light brown hair pulled back and moved through the ward with the particular economy of someone who had learned long ago not to waste motion. The other nurses liked her because she covered shifts without complaining and never started drama. The physicians tolerated her because she didn't ask for credit. Dr. Voss barely registered her existence for the first 8 months, and that suited Claire fine. That was the year she learned which supply closets were stocked inconsistently and which weren't stocked at all. She reorganized 3 crash carts on the overnight shift without being asked. She identified a recurring transcription error in the pharmacy workflow that had twice resulted in incorrect dosages, quietly flagged it to the pharmacy lead, and never mentioned it again. She was not trying to be noticed. She was trying to make the machine run better because that was what she'd always done, in one form or another. And the machinery had changed, but the instinct hadn't. She worked nights mostly, sometimes evenings. She had a small apartment on the east side of Redfield with a window that faced the mountains, and she spent her days off either running the ridge trail behind the water tower or sitting at her kitchen table with books she never quite finished. She didn't talk about her life before Redfield. Nobody pushed. People in small mountain cities understand, as a general rule, that some people come to places like Redfield specifically because nobody will push. It was the incident in March, Claire's second year, that first put her on Voss's radar in the wrong way. A 61-year-old man named Gerald had come in presenting with what the attending logged as moderate chest discomfort. Voss had been making rounds and reviewed the initial assessment in approximately 40 seconds. He'd ordered observation and moved on. Claire had been the nurse on that patient. She'd pulled Gerald's chart, looked at the 12-lead EKG the attending had glanced at and approved, and then looked at it again. The ST elevation was subtle, genuinely subtle, the kind of thing a physician could miss on a busy night without anyone being able to reasonably fault them. But it was there. She'd recognized the pattern not from a textbook but from a field, from a time and a place she didn't talk about, where you learned to read a dying person's vitals with equipment held together with zip ties under conditions no textbook ever described. She'd flagged the attending directly, calmly specifically with the exact numbers. The attending had hesitated, then ordered a repeat EKG and a troponin panel. Gerald had been in his cath lab within 90 minutes. He'd gone home 7 days later. Voss had found out 2 days after that. He hadn't said anything directly to Claire. He'd said something to the charge nurse, which the charge nurse had passed to Claire with an apologetic shrug. He said you went around the chain of command. Claire hadn't responded to that. There wasn't anything to say that would have helped. After that, Voss watched her. Not constantly. He had too much else to manage, and she was a night nurse who mostly worked when he wasn't there. But when he was on the floor and she was on the floor, she could feel the particular quality of his attention. It was the kind of attention that isn't looking for what you're doing right. The second incident had happened 4 months later, and this one hadn't gone as cleanly. A pediatric case. 6-year-old girl, abdominal pain, referred from an urgent care clinic with a note suggesting constipation. Claire had reviewed the child and disagreed with the assessment. She'd requested a surgical consult. The resident had declined, citing the urgent care note and Voss's standing directive about unnecessary specialist calls on overnight shifts. Claire had escalated. The resident had told her she was out of her lane. She'd documented everything and let it go. The child had been discharged. 12 hours later, the girl's mother had brought her back by ambulance with a ruptured appendix. The child had survived. She'd recovered fully. But the surgical team had gone back through the timeline and Claire's name had come up. And so had the declined consult request. And so had Voss's standing directive. Voss had called Claire into his office on a Tuesday morning. It was the first time they'd had a direct conversation. He was a tall man, spare in the way of someone who'd been athletic in his 40s and hadn't entirely abandoned the posture even as things had softened. He had gray at his temples and the kind of deliberate stillness that some people mistake for wisdom. "Sit down," he'd said. She'd sat. "I've been reviewing some incidents involving your conduct," he said. He hadn't looked up from the folder in front of him immediately. When he did, his expression was the expression of someone deciding something. "I want to be clear about how this hospital functions. There is a chain of command for a reason. When a physician makes a clinical determination, your job is to execute that determination, not to second-guess it, not to go around it." "I documented a concern," Claire said. "The concern turned out to be correct." "That's not the point." "I think for the patient it might be." Voss had looked at her for a long moment. "Know your place, Nurse Navarro." Claire had held his gaze for exactly 1 beat longer than was comfortable. Then she'd said, "Yes, doctor," and left. She hadn't mentioned the conversation to anyone, but after that her shift assignments started changing. Fewer trauma rotations, more administrative coverage. The work that was technically still nursing, but that kept her away from the cases where her skills actually mattered. It was the kind of demotion that doesn't have a name because it doesn't appear on any official document. It's just a slow repositioning, a gradual reduction of a person's territory, done patient enough that it's almost possible to pretend it isn't happening. Claire had noticed. She'd adapted. She'd done the work she was assigned and done it well, and kept her head down and said almost nothing. That had been the pattern for the past year. The morning the K9 came through the doors had started like every other Tuesday. Claire had been on a double. She'd picked up the overnight from a colleague who'd called in sick, and she was 2 hours from the end of her shift when the noise started. She'd been in the supply corridor, taking inventory of a crash cart that had been signed off as complete by someone who hadn't actually checked it. She had a clipboard in her left hand and a penlight in the right, and she was verifying the placement of laryngoscope blades in a way that had become reflexive. Not because she expected to need them, but because checking had been trained into her so deeply that she no longer had to decide to do it. She heard Voss's voice first, carrying from the direction of the nurse's station, with the particular carrying quality of a voice that was accustomed to being the loudest thing in a room. "I've made my decision. Navarro is off direct patient care effective immediately. Reassign her to the chart audit team." She'd heard her name and stopped moving. "Dr. Voss, she's one of the strongest clinical nurses we have on overnight. I didn't ask for your opinion, Sandra. Process the reassignment." Claire had stood in the supply corridor for a moment, holding the clipboard. The penlight was still on. She clicked it off. The fluorescent light above her buzzed faintly, an electrical tick it had had for as long as she'd been working at Cascade Valley. She put the clipboard back on its hook. She checked the cart one more time, everything in place, everything functional, and then she walked out of the corridor. She'd almost reached the nurse's station when she heard it. Not Voss. Something else. Coming from the main entrance. A single sharp impact of door against doorstop, and then the frantic sound of claws on linoleum, and then a voice she didn't recognize shouting, "Maverick! Maverick! Heel!" The dog came around the corner at speed. He was a Belgian Malinois, darker in the face than most, with the particular amber eyes of a working dog that has been trained to a level where the training and the animal have become inseparable. He was moving fast, but not erratically. There was direction in it, purpose, and he cleared the crash cart in the middle of the hallway without slowing, barely touching it, and then he was at Claire's feet. He sat. He dropped something from his mouth. She looked down. The armband was military-issue nylon, black, with a hook and loop closure that had been repaired once with a different colored strip of material. It was burned along one edge. Genuinely burned. Structural damage to the weave, not scorching from proximity, but from something sustained and direct. There was a patch on the face of it, barely legible through the soot and age. A call sign she recognized because it had been hers. Wraith 7. Her hand didn't move for 2 full seconds. The dog was watching her face the way working dogs watch faces, fully, without blinking, reading something she hadn't said out loud and wouldn't. A handler appeared around the corner at a dead sprint. Young, uniformed, wearing the dust of someone who'd been somewhere other than a hospital recently. He stopped when he saw the dog sitting at her feet. "I'm sorry," the handler said, breathing hard. I couldn't hold him. He hasn't done that since—" He stopped. He looked at her face, then at the armband, and stopped talking. The hallway had gone quiet without anyone deciding to make it quiet. An LPN named Daryl was standing motionless with a bag of saline halfway onto an IV pole. 2 residents had stopped walking mid-conversation. Sandra from the nurse's station had her hand on the desk phone and had forgotten what she was going to do with it. Dr. Voss was standing at the periphery of this. He was looking at Claire with the expression of a man who has just seen something he doesn't have a category for. Claire crouched. Not quickly. Slowly, carefully, the way you approach something you've been separated from for a long time and aren't sure how to hold yet. She put her hand flat on the floor near the dog's nose, not reaching for him, just offering. The Malinois pressed his face into her palm and made a sound low in his chest that wasn't quite a whine. She recognized him. She recognized the notch in his left ear, the specific pattern of his chest markings, the way his weight shifted forward onto his front paws when he was certain about something. She hadn't seen him in 4 years. She hadn't let herself think about him in almost that long. "Maverick," she said quietly. His tail moved once, twice, hard enough to knock against the linoleum. She straightened up slowly, the armband in her hand, and for the first time in 3 years in this hospital, she didn't look like someone trying to disappear. Voss said, "Navarro, what is going on?" The radio on the handler's vest erupted. The voice coming through it was controlled in the way military radio traffic is controlled. Not calm exactly, but disciplined, words chosen for maximum information density in minimum time. Claire had spoken that language for the better part of a decade. She caught it before anyone else in the hallway did. She caught convoy. Mountain Route 9. Multiple casualties. Estimated 6 to 9 minutes out. She was already moving before the handler had reached for his radio to respond. The first rig hit the ambulance bay 4 minutes later. Then another, and then 2 more in quick succession, and then what appeared to be a military transport vehicle that shouldn't have been able to park where it parked but did anyway. The casualties came in fast. 8 soldiers initially, with reports of 2 more being stabilized in the field. Penetrating trauma, blunt force injuries, burn injuries, and in 2 cases the kind of complex multi-system presentations that required someone to make 10 decisions in the time it usually took to make one. The ER attending on duty was a physician named Dr. Hallie Park, competent, experienced, but not accustomed to this volume arriving simultaneously, and the expression on her face as the first 2 gurneys came through the doors was the expression of someone recalculating. The trauma bays filled fast. Voss appeared. He always appeared when something was happening that might require someone to be in charge. and began issuing orders in a voice pitched to carry authority without giving specific enough instructions to be held accountable for them. Park, take the two most critical. I want stable assignments before we start any interventions. We do this by protocol. He said that last part specifically to the room. By protocol. Claire heard it from across the bay where she'd moved without being assigned, pulling a second laryngoscope from a supply drawer because she'd known the first was already in use, already laying out materials with a sequence that had nothing to do with a posted checklist and everything to do with muscle memory from a life she'd spent 3 years trying to set down. The nurses around her were scrambling. Good nurses, she knew their capabilities, but scrambling, because the volume was wrong and the layout of the bays didn't account for this. And no one had run a drill for 8 simultaneous trauma presentations in the last 2 years. She knew that because she'd looked at the drill records once and hadn't been able to stop thinking about the gap. She moved to Bay 3 without being assigned to it. The soldier in Bay 3 was 22, maybe 23, with the look of someone who had been trained past the instinct to show pain. He was conscious, which was worse in some ways because he knew what was happening to him. His oxygen saturation was dropping. She could see it on the monitor. And the quality of his breathing had that specific character she'd first learned to recognize not in a hospital, but in a place with no monitor and no overhead light, and a man dying in the dirt beside her while she made decisions with the equipment in a bag on her back. Tension pneumothorax, left side. She pulled the gloves from her pocket. She'd started keeping a spare pair in her right scrub pocket 18 months ago, after the 3rd time she'd needed them before she'd been able to get to a supply cart, and snapped them on. The attending for Bay 3 was a second-year resident named Dr. Osei, who was standing at the head of the bed and looking at the monitor with the expression of someone who had reached the edge of their training. His SATs are, Osei started. I see them, Claire said. She was already at the left side of the bed, her hands moving. I need a 14-gauge angiocath, and I need it now. Bay 3 supply cart, second drawer. Osei looked at her. We need to wait for Dr. Voss to... He doesn't have time for that. She said it without heat, without drama, as a simple statement of physical fact. Get me the angiocath. Osei got it. She found the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line the way she found it in the dark with her eyes closed, by touch and landmark, and the specific knowledge that there was no margin for error here. There never had been. The margin was the difference between living and not living, and she had been making that calculation since before this resident had finished medical school. The needle went in. The rush of air was immediate, audible, unmistakable. The oxygen saturation on the monitor climbed, slowly at first, then with gathering speed like something returning from a long way down. The soldier exhaled. His whole body changed with it, some fundamental tension releasing, the fight going out of the muscles that had been compensating. Osei was staring at the monitor. Osei said, his SATs are coming up. I know, Claire said. Get a chest tube tray ready. He's going to need a formal decompression. She was already turning to check on Bay 4 when she heard Voss's voice behind her. She recognized the register of it immediately. Not the volume, which was low, but the quality. She'd heard that quality in his voice twice before, and both times it had preceded something she hadn't been able to stop. Navarro. She turned. Voss was standing at the edge of Bay 3. He was not looking at the patient, who was breathing, whose color was improving, whose numbers were climbing on the monitor above the bed. He was looking at her. You performed an invasive procedure, he said, without physician authorization. She held his gaze. The patient was dying. That is not how this hospital functions. Then maybe it should. She heard the words come out of her mouth and recognized that she'd crossed a line she'd been careful about for 3 years, and recognized also that she didn't take them back. Voss's face did something complicated, not quite anger, but a rearrangement of features that suggested something held down hard. You're suspended, effective immediately. Security will escort you. Sir. The voice came from the entrance to the trauma bay. It was calm and had the particular flatness of a voice accustomed to delivering information in situations where the information matters more than the delivery. Everyone turned. The man standing in the doorway was in uniform, not hospital staff, not a patient, not a family member. He was compact, somewhere in his late 40s, with the posture of someone who had spent a long time being required to stand straight and had internalized it so completely that he probably stood straight in his sleep. His uniform carried insignia that Claire recognized without looking at directly. Two of the soldiers who'd come in on the gurneys were looking at him from their bays with the specific expression of men who recognize their commanding officer under conditions that are not ideal for anyone. Behind him, Maverick had reappeared from wherever the handler had taken him, and the dog walked to Claire's side and sat, and did not move again. The officer looked at the dog. He looked at Claire. His expression shifted in a way that was subtle and complete at the same time, like a photograph coming into focus. "Sergeant Navarro," he said. The name landed in the trauma bay like something physical. Not nurse. Not Navarro. "Sergeant." Voss's head turned slowly toward her. Claire didn't look at him. She was looking at the officer, and the burned armband was still in her hand where she'd been holding it since the hallway, and she hadn't even registered the weight of it until right now, until the word sergeant moved through the room and hit the walls and didn't leave. The name didn't echo. It didn't need to. It just sat there in the middle of the trauma bay while everyone who'd heard it tried to process what it meant, which was that the woman they'd been treating like furniture for 3 years had a rank, and the rank had been spoken by a man whose uniform made clear that his word in this room carried a different kind of weight than Voss's had ever carried. Voss recovered first, because Voss always recovered first. That was one of his genuine skills, the ability to reorganize his expression into something neutral before anyone could read what had actually moved across it. He looked at the officer with the particular steadiness of a man who wasn't going to concede the room without knowing what he was conceding. "I don't know who you are," Voss said, "but this is a hospital, and right now we're in the middle of a mass casualty event, and whatever you need to discuss can wait until—" "Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Dre," the officer said. He said it the way people give information they don't feel the need to justify. "Fort Calloway, Special Operations Command. And what I need to discuss can't wait, Dr. Voss, because 3 of my men are in those bays and one of them would not be breathing right now if we'd waited." Voss's jaw tightened. "The procedure performed on your soldier was unauthorized. Our protocols require physician—" "Your protocol," Dre said, "would have cost him his lung." He let that land. Then, "What's his saturation now?" Osei, from the head of the bed, said, 96 and climbing. Dre nodded once. He didn't say anything else about that. He didn't have to. Claire had not moved during this exchange. She was aware of Maverick's weight against her left leg. He'd shifted during the conversation, pressing into her the way working dogs do when they've found the person they were looking for and aren't entirely sure the situation is safe yet. She couldn't argue with the assessment. She looked at the monitor above Bay 3. 97 now. The soldier, she'd learned his name from the triage tag, Corporal Leon Waverly, 23 years old, from somewhere outside of Columbus, was watching her with the particular expression of a person who has just had their life saved by someone they don't know and isn't sure how to file that information. "Are you real?" Waverly said. She looked at him. "What?" "Sergeant Navarro, Wraith 7. His voice was rough from the oxygen they'd gotten onto him, but steady. "Ortiz told me about you. Said you pulled 3 guys out of a building and—" He stopped. "Sorry, I don't know if I'm supposed to say where." "You're not," she said. "Right." He swallowed. "But you're real." She picked up his chart from the foot of the bed and checked the next set of numbers because that was what she should be doing right now, not standing here receiving something she didn't know how to hold. "I'm real," she said. "How's your breathing feel?" "Better than it did 20 minutes ago." "Good. Tell me if that changes." She moved to Bay 4. Behind her, she could hear Voss speaking to Dre in the lowered register he used when he was trying to manage a situation by reducing its volume. And she could hear Dre not adjusting his volume in response. And she cataloged that and kept moving because there were still people who needed things from her that she actually knew how to give. Bay 4 had a staff sergeant named Pittman with a lacerated forearm and a compound fracture of the left tibia that was going to need ortho and probably surgery, and he was handling it the way soldiers handle pain they've been trained to expect, which is to say grimly and without complaint and with the occasional complete sentence through clenched teeth. The nurse assigned to him, a young woman named Becca, who'd been at Cascade Valley for 8 months and was technically good, but still hadn't fully learned to work fast, had his IV access established and his pressure cuff running, and was looking at the fracture with the expression of someone waiting to be told what to do next. "Get Dr. Park," Claire told her. "Tell her compound tib-fib, neurovascular status needs checking, ortho consult is going to be urgent. Go now, not in 5 minutes." Becca went. Pittman looked at her through the pain. "You the one who fixed Waverly?" "He's not fixed yet. He's better." "Heard what you did, though." Pittman's jaw flexed. "Wraith 7, we had a briefing. Before this deployment, your call sign came up." "In what context?" "The kind where they tell you what right looks like." He hissed through his teeth as the traction on his leg shifted. "Didn't expect to meet you in a hospital in Wyoming." "Nobody expects anything in Wyoming," Claire said. "That's why people end up here." Something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, but close. She checked his distal pulse in the fractured leg, found it present but weakened, made a note, moved on. The next 40 minutes were the kind that compress in memory afterward but stretch out moment to moment, each individual second demanding something specific. She moved between bays without being assigned, filling gaps before the gaps became failures, doing the work of anticipation that nobody teaches explicitly but that separates the people who manage crises from the people who survive them. She tracked which bays were falling behind on documentation and which patients were going to need imaging and which families had arrived in the waiting area and hadn't been updated, and she did all of this while doing the hands-on work of a trauma nurse at full stretch. And she did not think about Voss. Voss thought about her, though. She could feel it. He'd moved to the edge of the trauma area and was watching her in a way that had a different quality than his usual watching. Something less settled, like a man who has identified a variable he should have accounted for earlier and is now trying to determine what it changes. At the 45-minute mark, Dr. Park found Claire between bays and touched her arm briefly to get her attention. Park was a small woman with efficient movements and the practical bluntness of someone who had learned early that there wasn't time for softening. "You need to know that Voss is filing paperwork," Park said quietly, directly. "He's calling what you did in Bay 3 a reckless, unauthorized intervention. He's using language like endangered the patient." Claire processed that. "How is Waverly?" "Stable. Saturation's holding at 98. He's going to be fine." Park paused. "You know I can't officially—" "I know. If I were to contradict Voss's documentation, don't. Don't put yourself in the middle of it." She said it without bitterness because she meant it. The politics of the institution were what they were, and Park had a career and a family and things to lose that Claire didn't have the right to ask her to risk. "Just make sure Waverly's care doesn't get disrupted." Park looked at her for a moment. "For what it's worth, I've known what you were for about a year. The way you move in a trauma bay isn't something you learn in a nursing program." Claire didn't respond to that. "I should have said something sooner," Park said. "It wouldn't have changed anything," Claire told her, and moved on. Dre found her at the supply station at the edge of the trauma wing, where she was restocking a cart that had been depleted 3 times over in the last hour. He didn't approach with the body language of someone about to make a speech. He approached the way soldiers approach people they respect, directly, without performance. "You have a situation with your chief physician," he said. "I'm aware." "He's escalating it. He's contacted hospital administration. There's going to be a formal review." She opened a drawer and placed a roll of surgical tape in the correct position. "Is that why you came over?" "No." He was quiet for a moment. "I came over because I know who you are, Navarro, and I know what you walked away from, and I understand why you walked away from it. But I need you to understand that what happened on Route 9 this morning didn't happen in isolation." She stopped restocking. She turned and looked at him. "The convoy was hit," he said. "Deliberately. It looks like targeting. We're in the early phase of an investigation, which means I can't tell you more than that. But I need to know, and I'm asking you directly, not as a commanding officer, just as someone who needs to understand the situation. If there's anything you can tell me about why a unit that knew your call sign might have been on that road this morning." The question hit differently than she'd expected. She'd expected something about her credentials, her history, the documentation of what she'd done. She hadn't expected this. "Nothing," she said carefully. "I don't know why they were on that road." You haven't been contacted. Nobody's reached out. No unusual communication. Marcus. She used his first name without thinking about it, which meant she'd slipped back into something older than the last 3 years. I've been working night shifts at a hospital in Wyoming. Nobody reaches out. He looked at her for a long moment, reading her the way people who've operated in the same environment read each other. Not looking for deception exactly, but accounting for the possibility and then setting it aside when the data didn't support it. All right, he said, I believe you. What aren't you telling me? A lot, he said, but the part that matters to you right now is this. One of the men in that convoy had a connection to your past that neither of us knew about when you left, and that connection is why Maverick found you, and it's why the armband was what it was. He paused. The man who had it, he wanted you to have it back. He died on Route 9 this morning, before they got here. She didn't move. She'd learned over a long time in circumstances that required it how to receive information like this, how to take the impact and redirect it somewhere internal where it wouldn't interfere with what needed to happen next. She'd learned it so well that sometimes she forgot the information was still there, still sitting in whatever interior space she'd put it, until the timing was wrong and something broke the seal. Right now, she let it land and held herself very still. Who? She said. Staff Sergeant Daniel Rourke. She closed her eyes. 1 second, 2. Then she opened them. He was transferred after I left, she said. I didn't know he was still in the field. He'd been in and out. He re-enlisted twice. Dre's voice had the specific, careful quality of a man delivering information he knows is going to cost something. He told his unit about you, what you did on the Hamal operation. He carried the armband because he said it was the only thing he had from when things went right. The supply cart was still in front of her. The tape was still in her hand. She set it down on the correct shelf in the correct position because that was what her hands knew how to do. Okay, she said. Claire, I have patience, she said. I need to get back. Dre let her go. She was halfway down the hall when Sandra from the nurses' station appeared in front of her with the specific expression of a person who is carrying bad news they didn't choose to be carrying. Administration is here, Sandra said. Dr. Voss called the executive director. They want to meet with you now. I'm in the middle of... They were very specific about the word now. Claire looked back at the trauma bays. Dr. Park was in Bay 3 with Waverly. Pittman's ortho consult had arrived. The remaining patients were stabilized or in imaging. The bays didn't need her in the same way they had 40 minutes ago. She went. The meeting was in a conference room on the administrative floor, which was 3 floors above the emergency ward and had carpet and framed photographs of past hospital directors and the particular temperature of a room where nobody actually worked. Dr. Voss was already seated when she arrived, which meant he'd arranged things so that she would walk in last, which was not an accident. Across the table from him was the executive director, a man named Keith Boland, who Claire had met twice in 3 years and who had the look of someone who had spent his entire career being careful. Beside Boland was the hospital's legal counsel, a woman Claire didn't recognize. She sat down without being invited to. Nurse Navarro, Boland said. He had a folder in front of him. Thank you for coming. I was told I didn't have a choice. Boland looked briefly at the legal counsel. We've received a formal complaint from Dr. Voss regarding the events of this morning. Specifically, an allegation that you performed an invasive medical procedure, a needle decompression, on a patient without physician authorization in direct violation of hospital protocol and your scope of practice. The patient was dying, she said, for the 2nd time today. That's not for you to determine, Voss said. That's the point. You are not a physician. You are not authorized to make that call. I have 12 years of nursing experience and a background that includes whatever your background includes, Voss said, cutting her off in a way that told her he'd been waiting for that sentence. It does not supersede hospital protocol. And frankly, I think the question of your background is something this institution needs to look at very carefully, given that your personnel file contains no indication of Dr. Voss. The voice came from the door. Everyone turned. Dre was standing in the doorway. He had not knocked. He was not apologizing for not knocking. Behind him, 2 other uniformed personnel stood in the hallway. One of them was the handler who'd been chasing Maverick through the corridors that morning, and the other was a woman in a different uniform whose insignia Claire clocked without being able to immediately place it. Boland stood halfway up. "This is a private administrative—" "I'm aware of what it is," Dre said. He walked in and placed a manila envelope on the table in front of Boland. "This is a formal service record. It includes commendations, mission assessments, and medical performance evaluations spanning 9 years. The individual documented in that record performed emergency field medicine under combat conditions on over 40 separate occasions, with outcomes that were reviewed and certified at the command level." He looked at Voss. "She has performed more emergency decompressions in the field than most trauma surgeons perform in a hospital in a decade." Voss's face had done the thing it did when he was recalculating. "That record is not relevant to—" "Corporal Waverly's saturation is 98%, Dre said. "His latest chest x-ray shows full re-expansion. The physician who reviewed his imaging said, and I'm quoting directly, that the initial decompression was textbook." He pulled a chair out and sat down without being invited to, and he did it with the absolute ease of someone who doesn't need to be invited anywhere. "Now, I understand there's a question of protocol violation." "There is," Boland said. He'd lowered himself back into his chair, and he'd picked up the envelope but hadn't opened it yet. "Then let me tell you what I understand about protocol," Dre said. "Protocol is built around a normal operating environment. This morning's events were not a normal operating environment. What I observed in that trauma bay when I arrived was a senior nurse making the correct call with the correct technique at the correct time, in the presence of a resident who was outside his experience base and in the absence of any attending physician from this facility." He looked at Voss. "Where were you, Dr. Voss, when Waverly's saturation hit 78%? The room was very quiet. Voss said, "I was managing the overall— Where were you?" A pause. "I was in the primary trauma bay. Bay 1, Dre said, which had 2 patients with stable vitals and a full team." He opened his hands on the table. "I'm not here to file a complaint. I'm here to make sure that the woman who kept my soldier alive this morning doesn't get processed out of this building by someone who's embarrassed about where he was standing when it mattered." Boland looked at the envelope. He looked at Voss. He looked at the legal counsel, who gave him nothing useful. He looked at Claire. "Nurse Navarro," he said, "we're going to need to review Sir." The uniformed woman from the hallway stepped into the room. She hadn't been introduced. She spoke anyway. "I'm Special Agent Dana Morales, DOD Inspector General's office. I've been traveling with Lieutenant Colonel Dre's unit since yesterday." She reached into the bag on her shoulder and placed a second document on the table. This one in a different kind of envelope, with different markings on the outside that Claire could read from across the table. "We've opened a preliminary inquiry into the circumstances of this morning's convoy incident. As part of that inquiry, we're collecting documentation on all individuals who interacted with personnel from Fort Calloway today. That includes the medical staff at this facility." A pause. "We'd appreciate the hospital's cooperation." The temperature in the room shifted in a way that had nothing to do with the actual thermostat. Boland looked at the second envelope. He looked at his legal counsel with an expression that was trying not to be alarmed. She leaned over and said something quietly that Claire couldn't hear. Voss, for the first time since Claire had known him, looked like a man who had lost track of the room. He looked at her across the table, directly, without the management layer he usually kept between himself and the thing he was actually feeling, and in his expression was something she hadn't seen there before. It wasn't quite fear. It was the specific unease of someone who has been certain for a very long time that they understand how everything around them works, and who has just encountered evidence that they might have been wrong about something important. "This meeting is adjourned," Boland said, "pending review." "My suspension," Claire started. "Is on hold pending review," Boland said. He was looking at his hands. "Return to your duties, Nurse Navarro." She stood. She picked up nothing because she'd come in with nothing. She walked to the door, Voss said quietly, in a register she didn't think anyone else in the room caught. "This isn't finished." She stopped. She didn't turn around. She said equally quietly, "No, it's not." She walked out. Maverick was sitting in the hallway outside the conference room. The handler was there too, standing against the wall looking faintly embarrassed about the dog's location, but the dog had clearly made his own decision about where he was going to be, and the handler had stopped arguing about it. Maverick stood when she came out and fell in at her left side with the precision of a dog that remembers its training like breathing. She looked down at him. "You can't be up here," she told him. His tail moved once. "I know," she said. "Come on." She took the stairs back down to the ER because she needed the length of them to put herself back together. And by the third-floor landing, she was aware of something she hadn't fully processed while it was happening. She was shaking. Not visibly. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. That was one of the things training had done that she couldn't fully undo. But somewhere underneath the steadiness, there was a frequency she recognized from other days in other places. The body's honest accounting of what the mind had managed to hold at bay. She stopped on the second-floor landing, put her hand on the railing, breathed. Maverick sat beside her and didn't rush her. The armband was still in her scrub pocket where she'd put it when she needed her hands free. She took it out and looked at it in the stairwell light. The burned edge. The repaired closure. The patch that still said Wraith 7 in the faded print of a label that had been through more than she could currently make herself think about. Daniel Rourke had carried this for 4 years. He died on a mountain road in Wyoming this morning before she'd known he was anywhere near her. She folded the armband carefully and put it back in her pocket. Then she pushed open the door to the ER floor and walked through it. The trauma bays were quieter now. The acute phase was over. The patients were distributed into appropriate care pathways. The noise level had dropped from crisis to the ordinary sustained hum of an emergency ward managing its cases. Several of the soldiers had been moved to observation rooms on the second floor. Becca was doing paperwork at the station. Dr. Park was on the phone with radiology. What was not ordinary was the group of people standing near the nurse's station who had not been there when Claire left. There were 6 of them, soldiers, not patients, standing in the way soldiers stand when they're not on a mission, but haven't entirely stepped out of that mode either. They'd clearly come in from outside, still carrying the smell of mountain air and vehicle exhaust. One of them had an arm in a sling that hadn't been treated here. 2 of them she recognized from the earlier intake. The others she didn't. They were looking at her. One of them, a woman, late 20s, with the look of someone who had been crying and had stopped and wasn't going to start again, stepped forward. "You're Navarro," she said. "Yes." "I'm Specialist Torres. I was in the second vehicle." She paused, and the pause had weight. "Rourke was in my vehicle. Before it happened, he told me something. He said if anything went wrong, and if there was any way to get to this hospital, that I should tell you." She stopped. She pressed her lips together. She was young enough that she still showed everything on her face, and she was trying very hard not to. "He said to tell you that the mission files you flagged in 2019, the ones that got buried, weren't buried everywhere." Claire went very still. "He said someone's been holding them. He said," Torres swallowed. "He said you'd know what that meant." The floor of the ER was solid under Claire's feet, and the fluorescent lights were exactly where they always were, and Maverick was still at her left side. And all of that was true and real and present, and underneath all of it, something that Claire had filed away 4 years ago as closed and finished and irretrievable had just cracked open from the other side. She knew what it meant. She knew exactly what it meant and what it was going to cost, and the name of the person who had the files, and the name of the person who had ordered them buried, and that name was not a stranger's name. She looked at Torres. She looked at the other soldiers standing behind her. She looked at the nurse's station where Sandra was trying not to visibly listen, and at the corridor beyond it where Dr. Voss had appeared at the far end, too far away to have heard any of this, but close enough to see the group of people gathered around Claire and the expression on her face. "Tell me the rest," she said to Torres. Torres didn't look around to check who was listening. She'd made her decision before she crossed the floor, and she delivered the rest the way soldiers deliver things they've been holding too long. In pieces. Without decoration, with the specific flatness of someone who has been turning the words over long enough that the emotion has gone somewhere else and only the information remains. Rourke had been running his own thread for 2 years, quietly, off the books, the way soldiers with long memories and stubborn consciences sometimes do when they've watched something get buried and can't make themselves leave it there. He'd been collecting corroborating documentation on the 2019 incident, the one that had ended Claire's service, or rather the one that had made continuing her service untenable, from people who'd been adjacent to it and hadn't been directly ordered into silence. Not a formal investigation, just a careful, patient accumulation of the kind of secondary evidence that doesn't get swept in the initial cleanup, because the people doing the cleanup don't know it exists. He'd copied those files and distributed them to 3 different people before the convoy left Fort Calloway. Torres was one of them. The second was a JAG officer named Rice, currently stationed in Colorado. The third was a name Torres didn't know, which Rourke had described only as someone who'd been waiting for this specific package for longer than either of them had been tracking it. He said the name of the person who ordered the burial was in the files, Torres said. He said you'd been protecting someone by not saying it out loud. He said he understood why you did that, and he wanted you to know that the protection wasn't necessary anymore because the person you were protecting already knew what was coming. Claire said nothing for a moment. The ER continued around them. A phone rang at the nurse's station, a monitor alarmed briefly in a far bay before being silenced. The ordinary percussion of a hospital that has moved past its crisis and is returning to its baseline noise. The name in those files, Claire said. Rourke knew it. Yes. Did he tell you? Torres hesitated. He told me enough. That hesitation was information. Claire didn't push it. What Torres knew was Torres's to manage, and pushing her now. In the middle of an ER with Voss at the far end of the corridor and a federal agent somewhere above them, and a hallway full of soldiers who were watching this conversation with the particular focused attention of people who understand that something significant is happening without knowing exactly what, was not the move. Where are the files now? Claire said. I have a copy on an encrypted drive. Rice has a copy. The third? Torres shook her head. Rourke didn't give me a way to contact that person. He said they'd surface when the time was right. That's a very Rourke answer. Something moved in Torres's expression. The first thing that was about Rourke specifically, rather than the information he'd sent her to deliver. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Yeah, she said. It is. The cluster of soldiers behind Torres had stayed quiet through this exchange, but one of them, a sergeant, tall, with a cut above his eyebrow that had been field-dressed but not properly cleaned, was looking past Claire down the corridor toward Voss. He had the look of someone who's been watching someone else and doesn't like what he's seeing. Is that him? The sergeant asked. His voice was low enough that it was nominally private. Claire turned. Voss was still at the far end of the corridor. He was on his phone, turned partially away, but his angle was wrong for someone who was only making a call. He was positioned to keep the nurse's station group in his peripheral vision. Yes, she said. The sergeant said nothing else. He just noted it, the way you note the position of something you might need to account for later. Maverick had gone still in the way that meant he'd picked up something in the room. Not a threat signal, but a change in the air, a shift in the collective body language of the people around him that his training told him to register and hold. He was looking at the corridor, not at Voss directly, but in that direction, and his ears were forward. I need the drive, Claire told Torres. I know, but there's a condition. Claire looked at her. Rourke's condition, not mine, Torres said quickly. He was specific. He said the files go to Agent Morales, through you, with you present. Not through a third party, not through Dre, not through JAG, not through anyone who has institutional interests in how this lands. She paused. He said you'd understand why. She understood exactly why. Because the person whose name was in those files had institutional connections at multiple levels of the chain, and routing the evidence through any of those levels before it reached someone who sat formally outside of them was how evidence disappeared. Rourke had understood that from the beginning. He just needed time to build something solid enough that disappearing it would cost more than leaving it alone. All right, Claire said. She left Torres with the soldiers and walked the length of the ER to the corridor where Voss was standing. He'd finished his call by the time she reached him. He was holding the phone at his side with the deliberate relaxation of someone managing the appearance of calm. Going to tell me who you were calling? she said. That's not your concern. Keith Boland is upstairs trying to decide how much exposure this hospital has, she said. If you just called someone to help you manage that exposure, you want to think carefully about whether that person is someone whose involvement is going to make the situation better or worse. Voss's jaw worked briefly. You have no idea what you're... I know about the 2019 incident, she said. The quality of his stillness changed. It wasn't a visible flinch. Voss didn't flinch visibly. But something rearranged behind his eyes with the specific speed of a man who has been waiting for 4 years for someone to say a particular sentence and has spent that entire time constructing a response and is now finding that the response he built doesn't fit the shape of the moment. I don't know what you think you... Fort Calloway, July 2019, she said quietly. The Hamal operation debrief, the complaint I filed, the records that were sealed. She watched his face. You were there, Dr. Voss. You weren't a civilian employee then. You were attached to a DoD medical evaluation team. She let that sit for 1 second. 2. Which is how you recognized my name when I applied for this position, and why you hired me, and why you've spent 3 years making sure I stayed quiet and small and easy to remove. Voss said nothing. You hired me because you wanted to keep me where you could see me, she said. And when I stopped being invisible enough, you started the process of getting rid of me, which means you were still afraid of what I knew. His voice, when it came, was very controlled. You should be very careful about making accusations you can't support. I'm not making an accusation, she said. I'm telling you what happened. There's a difference. She left him standing in the corridor and went to find Morales. The DoD special agent was in a small consultation room off the main administrative hallway, working at a laptop with the focused economy of someone who does not waste time between tasks. She looked up when Claire knocked and came in, and her expression shifted into the specific alert neutrality of a federal investigator receiving unexpected information. I need 20 minutes, Claire said. I have 15. That'll do. She told Morales about Torres, about the drive, about Rourke's conditions, and about the name she had not said out loud in 4 years. She said it now. She said it once, clearly, and watched Morales' face confirm that it was a name the agent had encountered before in some context, without confirming what that context was. Morales closed her laptop. You understand what this opens? Yes. It's not just a personnel matter. What you're describing is obstruction of a military medical investigation and potential falsification of official records at the command level. The timeline puts it inside a federal jurisdiction. I know. You've been sitting on this for 4 years. I've been waiting for someone to build a case that couldn't be buried, Claire said. Rourke built it. I'm delivering it. Morales looked at her for a long moment. The drive needs to come directly to me. That's what Rourke wanted. Then get it! Claire went back down. Torres surrendered the drive without ceremony. She'd been holding it in the pocket of her jacket, and she placed it in Claire's hand with the careful relief of someone setting down something heavy they've been carrying too long. The soldiers around her were quiet. They knew what the drive was. They'd known Rourke. Some of them had served in proximity to the 2019 incident without knowing the specifics, and they understood now, or were beginning to, what the specifics were and what they meant. She was on her way back to the elevator when the overhead paging system activated. Code Gray. East Wing Corridor. Code Gray. East Wing. Wing. Code Gray was the hospital's designation for a security incident involving a combative individual. The East Wing Corridor connected the administrative floor to the records department. Claire had worked in this building for 3 years. She knew which incidents in the East Wing were ordinary. Agitated patients, family members, occasionally someone who'd come in intoxicated and decided the nurse's station was the problem, and which weren't. She took the stairs. She came out on the East Wing level to find 2 security guards outside the records room, and inside it, through the glass panel of the door, Dr. Voss standing over a records terminal with the particular focused urgency of someone who does not expect to be there much longer and is working against a clock they set themselves. He was deleting files. She could see it clearly through the glass, the specific repeated motion of someone clearing a screen, confirming deletions, moving to the next item with the compulsive speed of a man who knows that every second he's standing there is a second closer to being stopped. One of the security guards recognized her. Nurse Navarro, when did he go in? 4 minutes ago. He has a key card, so we couldn't stop him at the door, but the access log triggered the code gray automatically when... Get Boland, she said, right now. Get him physically in this hallway in the next 3 minutes. She looked through the glass at Voss. And don't let him leave that room. She didn't go in. She stood at the glass and let him see her standing there, let that specific information reach him, and watched the moment he looked up from the terminal and found her face on the other side of the door. He stopped moving. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has just understood the shape of a trap and cannot determine when he walked into it. She held up the drive in her right hand between 2 fingers so he could see it clearly. His face went through several things in rapid succession that she didn't need to read carefully. The sequence was familiar. She'd seen versions of it on other faces in other situations where the moment of reckoning arrived faster than the person on the receiving end had calculated. She lowered the drive and put it back in her pocket. Boland arrived 6 minutes later, not 3, and he arrived with the legal counsel and with a hospital security supervisor and with the specific expression of a man who has been receiving bad news in installments all day and has just received the next one. He took in the scene, Voss inside the records room, the guards, the access log the security supervisor was showing him on a tablet, Claire standing at the glass, and the careful expression he maintained professionally fractured briefly before he rebuilt it. Dr. Voss, Boland said through the door. Voss turned away from the terminal. He'd stopped the deletion process. Claire couldn't tell from here whether he'd stopped because he was finished or because he'd run out of time. He opened the door. Keith, he said, his voice was level. There's a security misunderstanding. I need you to step away from the terminal, Boland said. A pause. Then Voss stepped out of the room. The security supervisor went in immediately and began documenting the terminal state. Boland looked at his legal counsel. She said something that made him press his mouth into a thin line. He looked at Voss with an expression that had, finally, cleared of everything except the specific blankness of a man who has understood his situation and doesn't have a good move. Randall, Boland said, I need you to come with me. I can explain. I know you think you can, Boland said. Come with me anyway. Voss went. Claire watched them move down the East Wing corridor. Boland, Voss, the legal counsel, and the security supervisor in a configuration that was not yet an arrest but was not nothing either. And then she went upstairs and gave the drive to Morales. That was 3 hours ago. The shift had changed. The night staff was coming on and the day staff was filtering out, and the trauma bays that had been full and loud and urgent were now at ordinary evening capacity with ordinary evening cases. Corporal Waverly had been moved to a room on the 3rd floor and was reportedly sitting up and arguing with the nurses about food, which Claire had been told by Becca with the tone of someone reporting good news. Pittman was out of surgery. The orthopedic procedure had gone cleanly, as these things went, and was in recovery. The other soldiers were distributed through the hospital's observation rooms with their unit members rotating in and out of the visitor chairs. Dre found Claire in the break room at 6:40 p.m. She was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and the particular stillness of someone who has been running on adrenaline for 11 hours and has only just noticed. He sat across from her. Morales briefed me, he said. Okay. The drive is in federal custody. Rice in Colorado has been contacted. There's going to be a formal investigation. I know. It's going to take time, he said. These things always take time. I need you to understand that. I've been waiting 4 years, she said. I understand time. He was quiet for a moment. What you said to him, in the corridor. I shouldn't have done that, she said. I should have waited until after the drive was delivered. Why didn't you? She looked at her coffee cup. The honest answer was that she'd been holding that sentence for 4 years, and Rourke was dead, and she hadn't been able to make herself keep holding it. That was not a tactically sound reason. It was a human one. Because I was tired, she said. Dre nodded slowly. He didn't push it further. He understood, she thought, that there were certain kinds of tired that have nothing to do with sleep. What happens now? She said. Boland has placed Voss on administrative leave pending an internal review. The records team is auditing what was deleted. Apparently, he only got about 40 seconds into the process before the code gray triggered, so the damage is limited. He paused. Morales has a warrant application in process. It'll take a day or two. When it comes through, the investigation expands. To include the name in the files. Yes. She picked up the coffee cup and put it down again without drinking it. Voss is going to lawyer up tonight. He already has. He's going to claim the deletion was routine records maintenance. His lawyer will certainly try that, Dre said. The access log shows the specific files he targeted. Routine maintenance doesn't look like that. He looked at her steadily. The access log also shows, incidentally, that those same files were accessed twice in the past 18 months, both times from Voss's credentials, both times within 48 hours of a complaint being filed against him by a member of the nursing staff. She looked up. Twice? Dre said. The complaints disappeared from the official record before the review process completed. She hadn't known that. She'd known Voss was capable of it. She'd understood for a long time that his management of the hospital's internal complaint process was not coincidental, but she hadn't known the specific mechanism or the specific occasions. Who filed them? She said. One was a nurse named Patricia Odom, who resigned 8 months ago. The other was... He paused. It was Dr. Park. Claire absorbed that. Park, who had told her this morning that she'd known what Claire was for about a year. Park, who had said she should have spoken sooner. Park had tried. She'd just been stopped before it went anywhere. I need to talk to her, Claire said. She's still on the floor. Claire stood. The cold coffee stayed on the table. She found Park in the corridor outside the nursing station, making notes on a tablet with the focused concentration of someone filling the spaces in their mind with work, so the other things can't get in. Park looked up when she heard footsteps, and her expression shifted through several things, wariness, and something underneath it that was more complicated. You know, Claire said, that Dre told you about the complaint. Park lowered the tablet. Yes, I figured he would, eventually. She leaned against the wall. She looked tired in the specific way of someone who has been carrying something in secret and has been found out and doesn't know yet whether being found out is a relief or an exposure. I tried to go through the right channels. I know you did. It disappeared so cleanly. I couldn't prove he'd touched it. I didn't have documentation. All I had was the fact that I'd filed it, and then it wasn't there. And his word against mine isn't... She stopped. I told myself I'd try again when I had something concrete. And then you didn't, Claire said. Not as an accusation. As a statement of how these things usually go, because the gap between intending to try again and actually trying again is where most accountability goes to die. Park's jaw tightened. No, I didn't. You told me this morning that you should have said something sooner. I meant it. Then say it now, Claire said. Whatever you saw, whatever you filed, whatever you witnessed over the past however many years, Morales needs it. She needs it documented and on record. Not because it's going to be the piece that breaks this open, because Rourke's files will do that, but because the pattern matters. One complaint is an anomaly. 3 complaints across 3 different people with the same outcome is a system. Park was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I need a lawyer. Yes, Claire said. You do. Get one before you talk to Morales. That's not a suggestion. Park looked at her with an expression that was trying to be unreadable and wasn't quite getting there. Why are you helping me? I didn't help you when I could have. You're helping me right now, Claire said. That's how this works. She left Park with that and walked back toward the trauma wing, Maverick ghosting alongside her with the steady rhythm that she'd already started to take for granted, which was its own kind of information about how much she'd missed him without letting herself know it. The evening was settling into the hospital the way evenings do. The shift of quality of light through the exterior windows, the change in the sound of the building as fewer people moved through it, the specific quality of quiet that wasn't quiet but was a different kind of noise. She was passing the main corridor intersection when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Wyoming area code. She stopped walking. Maverick stopped beside her. She answered. The voice on the other end was male, older than middle-aged, with the specific cadence of someone who has spent a long time in institutional environments and has absorbed the language rhythms of carefully chosen words. She didn't recognize the voice, but she recognized, within 4 seconds of listening, the name he dropped into the first sentence, the name from the files, the name she'd said once to Morales and then put back away. Spoken with the casual familiarity of someone who had been watching events unfold from a considerable distance and had decided the distance was no longer sufficient. "You've had a busy day, Sergeant Navarro," the voice said. She said nothing. "I've been watching developments at Cascade Valley with some interest," he continued. "I understand a certain encrypted drive has changed hands. I'd like to discuss the contents of that drive with you directly, before the formal investigative process moves forward. I think there are aspects of the 2019 situation that you may not fully understand, and which would benefit from some context." "From you," she said. "Yes. The person who ordered the burial." A pause. "That's a reductive characterization of—" "Is there something specific you want?" she said. Another pause, this one with a different quality. "I'd like to meet. Tonight. I'm not far from Redfield. There's an address I'll send to this number. A facility that's been offline for about 2 years, nothing operational, just a place for a private conversation. You want me to come to an unoccupied facility at night alone? I want to talk, Sergeant, that's all. I think if you hear what I have to say, you'll understand why it would benefit both of us to reach an arrangement before this goes further." His voice hadn't changed in register or tone. It was the voice of a man who is accustomed to people coming to arrangements because the alternative had been made clear without being stated. "I'll send the address in 5 minutes." He ended the call. She stood in the corridor with her phone in her hand. The overhead lights hummed. Maverick was watching her face. Her phone buzzed 5 minutes later. An address? A building she knew, or knew of, the old County Emergency Management Facility off Route 12, decommissioned 2 years ago when the county consolidated services. Empty. Remote. No cameras, no staff, no one who would notice a vehicle parked outside after dark. She looked at the address for a long moment. Then she called Dre. He picked up on the second ring. She read him the address, told him the outline of the call, and told him she intended to go. "Absolutely not," he said. "He knows the drive is in federal custody," she said. "If he wanted to suppress it, he'd have moved before now. He's not calling to threaten me. He's calling because he's scared. And scared people who are also powerful people sometimes do things that make scared, powerless people look straightforward by comparison. That's exactly why you don't go alone." "I know," she said. "I need 4 of your people positioned outside. Not inside, not visible from the entrance, but close enough to move in under 3 minutes. I need them there before I arrive. And I need you to understand that if this conversation goes where I think it might go, what he says to me in that building is going to matter more than anything on Rourke's Drive." Silence on the line. "Claire," Dre said in a register he hadn't used with her before, not the officer's register, something older and less managed. "He's not going to just talk to you." "I know," she said, "but he doesn't know that I know that." She looked at the address again. 4 people. Outside. Close. Dre didn't answer immediately. In the pause, somewhere down the corridor, a door opened and then closed, and in the brief moment of open door, there was the sound of the hospital continuing its nighttime routines. Monitors, soft voices, the small, ordinary machinery of people keeping other people alive. And then the door was closed again, and there was just the hum of the lights, and Maverick's quiet breathing, and Dre's careful silence on the other end of the line. "I'll have 6, he said. She put her phone in her pocket and looked down at Maverick. His amber eyes were steady and certain in the way of a dog that has already decided where it's going and is only waiting for the person to catch up. "Come on," she said. She was almost to the exit when she turned the corner and walked directly into Voss. He was not supposed to be in the building. He'd been placed on administrative leave. Boland had walked him out. She'd seen it. She'd watched it happen. But there he was, in the corridor outside the east stairwell, in his street clothes rather than his white coat, with the look of a man who had come back for something he couldn't leave without. They were 3 feet apart. No one else was in the corridor. He looked at her, and then he looked at Maverick, and something in his face went through a rapid sequence of assessments that ended not in the controlled stillness she was accustomed to from him, but in something raw and less managed. "The drive," he said. "What's on it? You've seen it." "No," she said. "I haven't." "But you know." She waited. "You have to understand," he said, and his voice had dropped into a register she'd never heard from him. Urgent, stripped of the institutional weight he usually carried, briefly and completely human in the way that people sometimes become when they've run out of the performance. What happened in 2019 was not what the files describe. There was a context. There were considerations that weren't documented because they couldn't be. "Dr. Voss," she said, "you need to stop talking. If you just... You need a lawyer," she said. "You have one. Call them. Stop talking to me." She looked at him directly, steadily, the way she'd learned to look at things that required you to see them clearly without letting the looking affect your hands. "Whatever you came back here for tonight, it's not here. Go home." He looked at her for a long moment, then he looked at the dog. Maverick had shifted forward slightly, not an aggressive posture, but a readiness. His weight balanced and his eyes fixed on Voss with the uncomplicated attention of an animal that has classified the situation and is waiting on instruction. Voss took a step back. And then he did something she hadn't seen him do in 3 years of working under him, in 3 years of being dismissed and managed and quietly diminished, in 3 years of watching him operate with the assumption that he was the room's fixed point around which everything else moved. He looked away first. He walked past her toward the exit, and his footsteps were the only sound in the corridor, and she stood there until she heard the door at the end of the hallway open and close. She exhaled. Once. Then she and Maverick walked to the parking lot, got into her truck, and drove toward Route 12, and the dark of the mountain road opened up around her like something that had been waiting. Her phone buzzed on the seat beside her. A message from an unknown number, different from the one that had called her, but with a format she recognized from a lifetime ago. A brevity code, an old authentication sequence, the kind of thing that gets drilled into you in a previous life and never quite leaves. She read it at a red light. 3 words, files weren't buried. She stared at the message. Below it, one more line appeared as she watched. A name. Not the name from the files, a different name. A name she recognized with the specific shock of encountering something you'd understood to be gone from the world, something you'd filed permanently in the past, something whose absence you'd made your peace with. The light turned green. She did not move through the intersection. The cars behind her started moving before she did. Someone leaned on a horn, one short blast, the language of minor impatience, and she registered it distantly, her eyes still on the phone screen, on the name sitting below those 3 words like something that had surfaced from very deep water. Sergeant First Class Adela Marsh. Adela Marsh had been declared K1A in October 2019. Claire had been told this in a debriefing room at Fort Calloway by a colonel she'd never met before and never saw again, delivered with the specific careful flatness of official bad news. She'd had no reason to disbelieve it. She'd had every reason to believe it because she'd been there, or near enough, and the aftermath had been what it was. And in the months that followed, she'd packed her service record and her silence and her dog's leash and the particular weight of knowing that the things she'd witnessed had cost someone their life and left for Wyoming. She drove through the intersection. She drove 2 blocks and pulled into a gas station lot and sat with the engine running and the heater going and the phone in both hands. The message was still there. It didn't disappear. It wasn't a hallucination produced by 11 hours of adrenaline and grief and institutional combat. It was a name and 3 words and a brevity code she'd been trained to recognize. And both the name and the code were things that could only have come from one direction. She called Dre. He picked up immediately. "We're in position. You're 10 minutes out." "Change of plan," she said. "I need you to tell me everything you know about Adela Marsh." The silence that followed was 3 seconds long, which from Dre was a very long silence. "Where did you hear that name, Bob?" he said. "I just got a text from her." Another silence. "That's not possible." "I know what's possible," she said. "I know what they told me. I'm telling you what's on my phone right now." She heard him exhale, slowly, with the controlled quality of a man recalibrating under pressure. "Pull over." "I'm already stopped." "Okay." A pause. "Okay." Here's what I know, which is not everything, and I need you to understand that before I tell you. He waited for her acknowledgement. She gave it. Marsh was listed KYA in October 2019 based on field assessment following the Hamel operation. Subsequent recovery efforts were inconclusive. The site was compromised before a full search could be completed. The KIA designation was made official 30 days later. But there were inconsistencies in the site assessment that were flagged internally and then quietly closed. I found out about the flag because it appeared in a cross-reference with another inquiry I was running last year. And when I pulled the thread, it went somewhere I wasn't expected to go, and I was told, not asked, told, to leave it alone. She stared through the windshield at the gas station's overhead lights. A moth was orbiting one of them with the particular stupid persistence of something that doesn't understand what heat costs. "Who told you to leave it alone?" she said. "The same name that's in Rourke's files." Everything she'd suspected about the structure of this, the shape of it, the specific way it had been arranged, clicked into something she could see whole for the first time. The burial of her complaint. The KIA designation filed 30 days after an inconclusive recovery. Voss hired at a civilian hospital in Wyoming, positioned within reach of her. The convoy on Route 9 this morning, targeted, carrying men who were moving toward something. They weren't moving toward her. They were moving toward whoever Rourke had identified as the third recipient of the files. "The third person," she said. "Rourke's third copy." Torres didn't know who it was. "No," Dre said. "She didn't." It was Marsh. A beat. "If she's alive," he said carefully. "She just texted me," Claire said. "She's alive." She looked at the address on her screen, the Old County Emergency Management Facility off Route 12. Then she looked at the text again, at the 3 words in the name, and understood what she hadn't understood 30 seconds ago. The person who had called her to that building was not trying to negotiate. He was trying to collect. And the thing he was trying to collect wasn't the drive, because the drive was already in federal custody, and he knew that. He was trying to collect Marsh. He thought Claire knew where she was, and now that Claire had received a text that proved Marsh was alive and in contact, the logic of the trap became clear in the way logic clarifies when you are no longer looking at a piece of it, but at the whole. "He set this meeting so I'd lead him to her," she said. "Yes," Dre said. "That's what I think. Which means he doesn't know where she is. Which means she's been somewhere he can't reach her for 4 years, Dre said. And she's been waiting for Rourke's files to move because the files gave her cover, evidence she could corroborate, something that changes the calculus of coming forward from suicide to viable." Claire's hand tightened on the phone. "She's going to come to the meeting." "That would be my read," Dre said. "Yes, you bought it. She sent you the text because she knows you're going, and she's going too, and she needed you to know she exists before you walked into that building, so that whatever happens in there, you're not walking in without the full picture." 6 people outside," she said. 6 people outside," he confirmed. "And Morales is 10 minutes behind you, which I arranged without telling you because I knew you'd tell me not to." "I would have told you not to." "I know," he said. "Drive." She drove. Route 12 after dark was the kind of road that makes you understand why people who grew up in mountains develop a specific relationship with the dark. Not fear of it exactly, but respect for its completeness, for the way it removes the depth cues that tell you how far the edge is. Her headlights cut a manageable tunnel through it, and she drove steadily inside that tunnel with Maverick in the passenger seat and the burned armband in her jacket pocket, and the weight of everything today had moved sitting somewhere between her shoulders. She'd eaten nothing since 6 a.m. She was aware of this the way you're aware of things that can't be fixed right now. The facility appeared on her right, a low concrete building that had been built in the 1980s for a specific purpose and had never been beautiful and was now decommissioned and dark, with a gravel lot in front and a chain-link perimeter that had a gate standing open. Someone had opened it recently. The gravel was disturbed. She parked outside the perimeter and sat for 60 seconds. No movement. One vehicle inside the lot, dark-colored, backed in against the building's east wall in the way people park when they've thought about leaving in a hurry. The building's entrance had a light over it, battery-powered, portable. the kind you buy at a hardware store and clip to something. Someone wanted to be able to see the door. She texted Dre, "I'm here." His reply came in 4 seconds. "We see you. 6 in position. Go when ready." She got out. She looked at Maverick. "Stay close," she said. He moved to her left side and held there. She walked through the gate. The door to the facility was unlocked, propped with a wedge, a detail she noticed and cataloged, because propping a door means you either expect to need to move fast or you're expecting multiple arrivals and want to remove the delay. The inside smelled of concrete and old paper and the specific mineral cold of a building that has been unheated through multiple Wyoming winters. The main room was large and low-ceilinged, lit by 2 more portable lights positioned to illuminate the center of the space and leave the perimeter in shadow. There was a table in the center with 2 chairs across from each other, which was a choice, an arrangement, a statement about how this was supposed to go. The man sitting in one of the chairs was in his 60s, white-haired, with the posture and the hands and the unremarkable professional face of someone who had spent a long career being the person in rooms who nobody subsequently remembered. He was in civilian clothes. He had nothing visible on the table in front of him. She recognized him from a photograph she'd seen once, briefly, in a file that had been above her clearance level, the kind of file that gets left open on a desk by accident or by design, and you see what you see and file it and say nothing about it. Brigadier General Walter Fenn, retired, officially, since 2021. He looked at Maverick and then at her and said, "You drove faster than I expected." "I had motivation," she said. She sat in the other chair because she was not going to stand while he sat, and she put her hands on the table where he could see them, and she looked at him directly. "You wanted to talk." "I did." He folded his hands in front of him with the particular deliberateness of a man who manages his body language consciously. "I want to explain the context of 2019, as I mentioned on the phone. I think there are aspects—" "Who else is in this building?" she said. A pause. "Just us." "Then why is the door propped?" He looked at her for a moment. "You're more direct than I expected. Who else is in this building?" "No one who's going to cause you any difficulty," he said. "I brought one person. He's in the back corridor. He'll stay there." One person. Singular. Which meant Fenn had come with a minimal footprint, which tracked. A man in his position didn't move heavy when he was trying not to leave a record. One person in the back corridor, possibly armed, definitely positioned to move if the conversation went in a direction Fenn decided he didn't like. Maverick had oriented slightly left. Not dramatically, just a subtle shift in his weight, a direction of his attention. He'd scented something from the left side of the building, not the direction Fenn had indicated. She noted that and said nothing about it. "Talk," she said. Fenn talked. He was a good talker. She could see why he'd operated at the level he had for as long as he had. There was an intelligence to his construction of things, a lawyerly quality to the way he assembled context around events rather than denying the events themselves. He didn't deny 2019. He didn't deny the Hamal operation or the debrief or the complaint she'd filed. He described them as he chose to describe them, as a complex operational situation in which difficult decisions had been made with incomplete information under conditions of significant pressure, and in which the recording of those decisions had been managed in a way he acknowledged was not standard. "Managed," she said. "There were considerations of operational security that you buried my complaint because I identified the specific point at which your decision killed 2 of our people and endangered the rest," she said. "And you buried Marcia's testimony for the same reason, and then you listed her KYA so she couldn't surface." Fenn was quiet. "She got out," Claire said. "I don't know how, but she got out and she stayed out and she kept whatever she knew somewhere you couldn't reach it. And when Rourke started moving the files, she decided it was time to move too." "Rourke was a problem," Fenn said. She looked at him. "Is that how you describe a man who's dead?" Something moved in his expression, not quite guilt, but something adjacent to it, an acknowledgement that landed briefly and then was managed away. "The convoy incident this morning was not something I had any—" "Stop," she said. "I don't want to hear that sentence." He stopped. The building was quiet around them. Maverick had not moved, but the direction of his attention hadn't shifted back. Whatever he'd scented on the left was still there, still registering. She was thinking about the door, about the propped door, and the one person in the back corridor, and the vehicle backed in against the east wall, east, which was the right side of the building from the entrance, not the left where Maverick was pointing. 2 vehicles. She'd only seen one. You said one person, she said. Yes. Back corridor. Yes. Then who came in the second vehicle? Fenn's hands shifted on the table. A small movement, a micro-adjustment, the kind of thing that happens when a person's body processes information faster than their expression does. The left side of the building produced a sound. Not a large sound. The sound of a door that has been opened carefully and is being held carefully and is moving by small increments because the person moving it is trying to be quiet. Maverick turned his head and his ears went forward, and he made no sound at all, which was trained behavior and more alarming than a bark. Claire pushed back from the table and stood in one motion. She put herself between Fenn and the left wall. Walter, she said. His first name. A choice. Whatever is about to happen, you want to think very carefully. He stood too. His face had shifted into something that was trying to stay arranged and wasn't entirely succeeding. There are 6 special operations personnel within 3 minutes of this building and a federal agent behind them, she said. Whatever your second person is doing right now, it's happening in front of witnesses who are not going to disappear. She held his gaze. Call them off. A long moment. Then Fenn said, without turning his head, Stand down. Silence from the left side of the building. Then a different sound, movement, but not the careful kind. Faster. Going away from them, not toward them. A door opened and closed at speed. Outside. Footsteps on gravel, fast, and then the sound of a vehicle starting. The Dre's people would have the second vehicle. She knew without checking that they'd have eyes on it. She looked at Fenn. He looked older than he had 60 seconds ago. Sit down, she said. He sat. She sat across from him again. Maverick came back to her left side. The portable lights hummed between them. Here's what's going to happen, she said. Morales is going to come through that door in about 6 minutes. When she does, you're going to have 2 choices. You talk to her now, here, with me present, and you tell her the accurate version of 2019 and everything adjacent to it. Or you don't, and you leave here tonight and deal with what's coming through the proper investigative process, which is going to take longer and is going to be more public and is going to involve Rourke's files and Marsh's testimony and mine and Park's and probably a list of other people I don't know about yet. She put her hands flat on the table. Those are the choices. There's no arrangement. There's no version of this where you talk to me privately and the drive disappears, because the drive is already in federal custody and has been for 4 hours. Fenn was looking at the table. I didn't come here to negotiate, she said. I came here because I wanted you to know that I know the whole of it, not a piece of it, all of it. She paused. And because Marsh deserves to walk back into daylight with someone she trusts standing next to her, so I'm going to stand next to her. Fenn looked up. She's here, he said. It wasn't a question. I don't know where she is, Claire said. But she'll be wherever she needs to be when she needs to be there. The silence between them had a different quality now. Not the strategic silence of 2 people managing a negotiation, but the specific quiet of a situation that has moved past the point where managing it is possible and has arrived somewhere that only has one exit. The door opened. Morales came in first, with 2 of Dre's people behind her, and Dre himself a step behind them, and the room reconfigured around the new arrivals with the shift of power that rooms undergo when the people with actual authority enter them. But it was the figure behind Dre that stopped Claire's breathing for a half second. She was thin, thinner than her file photograph, thinner than she'd been in 2019, and she had the look of someone who had spent 4 years outdoors and off-grid, and under the specific pressure of being a person who officially didn't exist. Her hair was shorter. She had a scar along her left jaw that hadn't been there before. She was wearing civilian clothes that didn't fit quite right, the way clothes don't fit when you've bought them quickly and recently. She looked at Claire across the room. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Adela Marsh said, "You look terrible." And Claire said, "You're supposed to be dead." "I know," Marsh said. "I've been working on fixing that." Ben had gone very still at the table. He was looking at Marsh with the expression of a man confronting a consequence he had calculated against and lost. And the calculation had been running for 4 years, and the loss was arriving now, all at once, in a decommissioned concrete building off Route 12 in Wyoming at 8:47 in the evening. Morales had her credentials out. She was speaking to Fenn in the measured cadence of formal procedure, advising him of the nature of the inquiry and his rights within it, and Fenn was listening with the specific stillness of a man who has shifted from negotiation mode into management mode because negotiation is no longer available. Dre crossed the room to Claire's side. He looked at her and at Marsh and said nothing for a moment. "The second vehicle," Claire said. "We have it," he said. "Driver's in custody. He's military, active duty, attached to Fenn's former unit. That's a problem for tonight." "Bigger than this?" "Different. It extends the investigation in a direction Morales was already looking." He paused. "She's going to need to talk to you both tonight. It's going to be a long night." "I know," she said. Maverick had crossed the room while she wasn't watching and was sitting 3 feet from Marsh, head tilted, with the look of a dog who has encountered someone from his past and is performing a careful assessment. Marsh looked down at him with an expression that was trying to stay composed and wasn't entirely managing. "He made it," Marsh said. "He found me this morning," Claire said. "He remembered." "Of course he did," Marsh said, and something in her voice cracked at the edge of the word remembered, and then steadied again, the way voices do when there's too much to process, and you focus on the manageable piece because the rest can wait. Morales finished her preliminary statement to Fenn and looked across the room at Claire. "I need the room." "Give us a minute," Dre said. Morales looked at him. She looked at Claire, at Marsh, at the configuration of things in the room. She made a decision. 2 minutes, she said, and stepped to the far side of the space with Fenn and the 2 other personnel. In the relative privacy of those 2 minutes, Claire looked at Marsh and Marsh looked back. And there was the kind of silence between them that doesn't require filling because it is itself a form of communication between people who have known each other in circumstances that generate a specific quality of understanding. "The files," Claire said. "I have the originals," Marsh said. "I've had them since 2019. Rourke found out 2 years ago. He's been building the corroborating evidence since then." A pause. He knew it was close. He knew they were tracking his movements. He knew about the convoy. Marsh was quiet for a moment. He knew there was a risk. He took it anyway. Claire said nothing. "He wanted the files to land," Marsh said. "That was the whole thing, all of it. Just land them somewhere they couldn't be picked back up." "They landed," Claire said. Marsh looked at the room around them, at Morales and Fenn and the personnel and the portable lights and the concrete walls of a building that had been picked for its isolation and had become instead a place where something ended. "Yeah," she said. "They landed." Morales was walking back toward them. "One more thing," Claire said quietly, with the 2 minutes almost gone. "When this is over, the investigation, the testimony, whatever comes next, what are you going to do?" Marsh considered this. She'd been a person without an official identity for 4 years. The question of what came after existing was genuinely open. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I'm not disappearing again." "No," Claire said. "Neither am I." Morales reached them. "I need you both," she said. "Now." They followed her. Behind them, at the table, Walter Fenn sat very still and looked at the surface in front of him and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that was going to change the shape of what was coming. His phone, on the table beside his folded hands, buzzed 3 times in rapid succession. He looked at the screen, then he looked up at the room, at Morales, at Dre's personnel, at Claire and Marsh standing side by side in the portable light, and his face did something that had no management left in it at all. He picked up the phone and read the message and set it face down on the table. Morales, who had been watching him peripherally, crossed back to him. "General Fenn, I'm going to need that phone." He didn't resist. He pushed it toward her. She read the screen and her expression tightened in the specific way of someone receiving confirmation of something they'd suspected and hoped was wrong. She looked at Dre. She looked at Claire. Voss is gone, she said. He left his residence 40 minutes ago. His car was found abandoned outside Redfield. He didn't take his phone, his wallet, or his keys. The room absorbed that. He has a contact, Marsh said quietly, from beside Claire. Someone in the county. I've been tracking Fenn's local network for 8 months. There's a man, former logistics officer, lives outside Redfield on the east side, has a property with a secondary structure that doesn't appear on any county records. She looked at Morales steadily. I have the address. Morales was already reaching for her radio. Claire's hand went to her jacket pocket and found the armband, and she held it there without taking it out, and felt the burned edge under her fingers, and thought about Daniel Rourke, who had carried it for 4 years, and about what it had cost, and about the fact that it was not finished yet, that it was close, but the line between close and done was exactly the kind of line that people on the wrong side of it cross when they have nothing left to lose. Maverick pressed against her left leg. She looked down at him, and then up at Marsh, and then at the door. Morales was already moving before Marsh finished the sentence. She had her radio in one hand and her phone in the other, and she was issuing 2 separate streams of information simultaneously. Coordinates to the field team outside, a request for county law enforcement backup on a second channel, with the particular split-focus efficiency of someone who has run enough of these situations that the logistics have become automatic and the thinking can happen above them. Dre's people were moving too. The organized dispersal of trained personnel from a space has its own sound. The specific rhythm of gear being checked, positions being communicated in abbreviated exchanges, vehicles being reached without running because running wastes energy and announces intention. Claire stood in the middle of it and did not move immediately. Marsh was watching her. What are you thinking? I'm thinking Voss has been inside this investigation longer than we realized, Claire said. He's not running because he panicked. He's running because someone told him to run, which means he has a destination and a plan and probably a timeline. Fenn, or whoever Fenn was talking to before Morales took his phone. She looked at the man still sitting at the table across the room. He was between 2 of Dre's personnel now, not restrained but not going anywhere, his face carrying the specific stillness of someone who has exhausted his immediate options and is waiting to see what shape the next hour takes. He made calls before I arrived. He had 40 minutes minimum from when he called me to when I got here. That's enough time to move a person. Marsh said, if Voss reaches that secondary structure, he won't find cover there, Claire said. He'll find a problem, because Morales is 10 minutes ahead of him and your address is good. My address is good, Marsh confirmed with the flat certainty of someone who has been running surveillance on a network for 8 months in conditions that didn't allow for error. Then he's running toward a situation that's already closed. Claire looked at the door. But I want to be there when it closes. Dre appeared at her shoulder. Morales wants you to stay here. I know she does. Claire. His voice had that register again, the one that wasn't a commanding officer's register. You've been awake for... I know how long I've been awake. She looked at him directly. I've been waiting 4 years for this specific night. I'm not going to wait in a concrete building while it finishes. A pause, then, get in my vehicle. Marsh rides with us, and you do what I tell you when we get there. Reasonable, she said. They went. The drive from the emergency management facility to the east side of Redfield took 14 minutes on roads that were empty and dark, and Claire spent most of it watching the side window and the way the mountain dark moved past it, and thinking about the structure of things, about how the same qualities in a person that make them useful in a crisis make them difficult to manage when the crisis is over, and about how institutions handle that difficulty, which is usually by suppression, and about what it costs the people doing the suppressing when the suppressed thing refuses to stay down. Voss had known who she was when he hired her. She'd understood that in the corridor of the hospital after Dre arrived, and she'd sat with it through the hours since, and the full shape of it was still arriving in pieces. He'd hired her because proximity felt like control, because having her visible and manageable and professionally diminished felt safer than having her somewhere he couldn't see, and he'd spent 3 years making sure she stayed in that shape, shrinking her territory, reassigning her away from the work that might remind anyone, including herself, of what she was actually capable of. She thought about the Gerald case in her second year, the EKG she'd read, the attending who'd hesitated and then listened. She thought about the pediatric appendix, the consult request that had been declined, the 12 hours between her assessment and the rupture. She thought about 3 years of overnight shifts and chart audits and crash carts she'd reorganized without being asked, because doing the work was the only thing she knew how to do when everything else was being taken away. She'd been useful in all of it. She'd been useful while being reduced, which was its own kind of stubborn. Not heroic, just persistent. The way certain materials don't compress no matter what you put on top of them. She hadn't experienced it as strength at the time. She'd experienced it mostly as the alternative to quitting, and quitting had never been in her operating vocabulary. Marsh was in the back seat, and Claire could hear her breathing. Steady, regulated, the breathing of someone who has spent a long time in situations that required her to manage her own fear the way you manage a chronic condition, not by eliminating it, but by learning its patterns. "When did you know you could move?" Claire said. "When Rourke told me he had enough," Marsh said, 2 months ago. He said he'd built the secondary corroboration. He said the third copy was going to you. He didn't tell me. He wasn't sure you'd accept it if he asked first. A pause. He knew you. He knew you'd spent 4 years building a quiet life, and he didn't want to be the person who came to you asking you to burn it down. He wanted to give you the option after the fact. Claire absorbed that. It was a very Rourke calculation, generous and also slightly infuriating, and she couldn't say whether she'd have made a different choice if he'd asked directly, which was probably exactly why he hadn't asked. "He was right," she said. "I don't know what I'd have said." "Neither did he," Marsh said. "That's why he didn't ask." The vehicle slowed. Dre, in the driver's seat, said, "We're a quarter mile out. Morales has 2 vehicles on the property. Local law is 3 minutes behind." The property appeared on the right as they came around a long curve. A working ranch-style lot, dark, with a main house, and behind it, visible only because of the light Morales' team had positioned on it, a secondary structure that sat low and unadorned and bore no resemblance to anything that would appear on a county assessor's record. Metal roof, no windows on the visible face, a single door standing open. Open. Dre stopped the vehicle 200 meters back. He was on his radio immediately. The open door produced information without anyone having to explain it. Either Voss had arrived and gone inside, or he'd arrived and gone through and out the other side, or the person who'd set this up had never intended it to be a destination and had intended it to be a waypoint. Claire got out of the vehicle. "Navarro!" Dre's voice behind her. "I'm not going to the building," she said. "I'm looking at the tree line." She was looking at the tree line because the property's east edge backed against a section of mountain pine forest that connected, if you knew the terrain, to a service road that came out 3 miles north on Route 12. The same Route 12 she'd driven in on, the same road that had, if you followed it far enough, access to the mountain pass and beyond it to the next county and the diminishing returns of running. She'd run that ridge trail behind the water tower on her days off for 3 years. She knew the terrain east of Redfield better than most people who'd lived there their whole lives, because running it had been the closest thing she'd had to the kind of movement her body remembered from before Wyoming, and she'd needed that memory to stay functional. She knew exactly where a person would go if they understood this property and this tree line and this service road. "He's not in the building," she said. "He went through it." Dre was beside her now. He looked at the tree line and then at her face and read something there that was either convincing or he decided to trust it regardless. He got back on his radio. Morales' team shifted. 2 people went around the property's north perimeter toward the tree line. 2 stayed on the building. Maverick, who had been in the vehicle's rear and had come out when Claire did, was standing at her left, and his attention was not on the building. It was on the darkness at the edge of the pines. "Can he track in the dark?" Dre said. "He was trained for it," she said. "But I'm not sending him in alone." "Nobody goes in alone." She looked at him. "I'll go," he said. It wasn't an offer. It was a statement of what was going to happen. "You stay on the perimeter." She didn't argue. Not because she conceded the point, but because Dre going into that tree line with 2 of his people, and Maverick was the operationally sound version of the decision, and she was tired enough that the operationally sound version was the one she was going to let happen. "He goes with you," she said, meaning the dog. Dre looked down at Maverick. "Does he take commands from me?" "He'll follow your lead if I tell him to," she said. "Maverick." The dog looked at her. She gave him the hand signal, flat palm toward Dre, then 2 fingers forward. "With him." Maverick looked at Dre. He accepted this with the specific workmanlike quality of a dog who understands that the mission is the mission regardless of who's running it. They went into the trees. Claire stayed at the perimeter. She stood in the dark with her hands in her jacket pockets and the armband under her left fingers and listened to the sounds of the property settling. Morales' team at the building, vehicles on the road behind her, the distant sound of local law enforcement arriving and being briefed. Marsh had stayed in Dre's vehicle because going to a location that was live and unsecured would have been the wrong move for someone who'd spent 4 years not existing, and Marsh, whatever she'd been through, still thought tactically. The waiting was 11 minutes. At the 11-minute mark, Dre's voice came on the radio that one of his remaining people was carrying. "We have him, east side of the tree line, approximately 300 meters in. He's cooperating." She exhaled. The personnel around her exchanged looks that had the specific quality of people standing down from something they'd been holding at full tension. One of them said, "Copy," into his radio. Morales, coming around from the north side of the building, heard the traffic and stopped walking and put her hands on her hips and looked up at the sky for a moment with an expression that was not relief exactly, but was the thing that comes after the thing you'd been preparing for when the preparation turns out to have been enough. She looked at Claire. "You knew where he'd go," Morales said. "I guessed," Claire said. "Based on what?" 3 years of running in the dark out here. She pulled her hands out of her pockets. And the fact that people who've been powerful for a long time all run the same way when they finally run. They go for the exit they identified years ago and never thought they'd actually need. Morales looked at her steadily. "I need you in my office tomorrow morning, 7 a.m., both you and Marsh. We'll be there." Morales nodded and turned back toward the building and the process of closing a site, which was its own kind of work. Documentation, chain of custody, coordination, the procedural machinery that would begin tonight and run for months. Dre emerged from the tree line 24 minutes later with his 2 people in Maverick and a handcuffed Dr. Randall Voss, who was wearing the civilian clothes he'd left his residence in and who had a cut on his right hand from something in the forest that hadn't been treated, and who looked, in the portable light now trained on the property, precisely like a man who had run and been caught, which was to say, diminished in a way that was permanent. He saw Claire. He didn't say anything. She hadn't expected him to. She looked at him for a long moment, not with the feeling she'd expected to feel, which was something sharp and satisfied, but with something quieter and more complicated, the specific feeling of watching a thing you've been afraid of for a long time reduced to its actual size. He was not, at this scale, frightening. He was a man who had used power badly and had spent years making sure the people around him couldn't afford to say so. And now the people around him could afford to say so, and without that architecture of suppression, he was just a man with a cut on his hand standing in the dark in Wyoming. She turned away from him and went back to the vehicle where Marsh was waiting. The investigation took 5 months. Not the arrest. That was the work of one night and the following morning, and by the time Claire walked into Morales' office at 7 a.m. the next day with Marsh beside her and 3 hours of sleep behind her, the machinery was already running. Federal charges were filed against Walter Fenn within 72 hours of his detention at the emergency management facility. The charges were specific and substantial: obstruction of a military investigation, falsification of official records, and, added after the second week of review, when the scope of the Hamal operation documentation became clear, conspiracy to endanger federal personnel. Fenn hired 4 lawyers. It didn't help him the way he'd expected it to. The documentation Rourke had built was not the kind of evidence that degrades under pressure. He'd been careful, more careful than anyone had given him credit for while he was alive, and the secondary corroboration he'd spent 2 years assembling held up under the review process with the specificity of something built by a person who understood how these things got picked apart and had accounted for it. The JAG officer, named Rice in Colorado, submitted his copy to the investigation on the 3rd day. Marsh's original files, the ones she'd been carrying for 4 years, went in the same week, and the combination of the 3 sets of documentation created an evidentiary picture that Fenn's lawyers spent 6 weeks trying to characterize as incomplete and then stopped trying. Voss's charges took longer to formalize because the jurisdictional lines between his military past and his civilian present required careful navigation, but they were formalized. Obstruction, falsification, intimidation of hospital staff, a charge that emerged from Dr. Park's testimony and from the records of the two buried complaints, which the hospital's own IT forensics team was able to partially reconstruct from server logs, despite his 40-second deletion attempt. The charge that carried the most weight, practically speaking, was one Claire hadn't anticipated. 2 patient outcomes at Cascade Valley Medical Center, reviewed in the context of the investigation, were flagged for further examination. The pediatric appendix case from Claire's second year was one of them. The review found that the delayed consult had directly contributed to the severity of the rupture, and that the documentation had been altered after the fact to reflect a more conservative timeline of clinical decision-making. The alteration had been made from Voss's credentials. His medical license suspension came through before the criminal charges resolved. The Wyoming Medical Board issued the suspension in month 3 of the investigation, and the statement they released was specific about the grounds: falsification of patient records, intimidation of clinical staff, and abuse of administrative authority in ways that had compromised patient care. The statement was 42 words that represented 11 years of conduct, and it was public, and it appeared in the regional news cycle, and it did not disappear. Claire read it on her phone on a Tuesday morning, sitting at the table in her apartment with a cup of coffee that she'd actually remembered to drink while it was hot. She read it twice. Then she put the phone face down and looked out the window at the mountains for a while. She wasn't sure what she'd expected to feel. Triumph was the word people probably would have used, but triumph implied a contest, a winner, and what she mostly felt was something more like the specific quiet that comes when a noise you've been hearing for so long you'd stop noticing it finally stops. The absence of weight, the strange lightness of being in a room where something has been removed. She'd been asked 2 months into the investigation whether she intended to remain at Cascade Valley. Boland had come to her directly, which was more than she'd have expected from him. He'd asked to meet, they'd met, he'd sat across from her in the same conference room where he'd held the administrative meeting the morning of the convoy, and he'd been honest in a way she suspected cost him something. "I didn't know about the complaint suppression," he said. "I want to be clear about that." "I believe you," she said. "I should have known. That's different." He looked at his hands. "The hospital has significant rebuilding to do. Internally, culturally. The staff has been operating under a system that punished honesty, and I didn't see it clearly enough." He paused. "I'm saying this because I want to ask you something, and I want the context to be honest first. Ask. Would you be willing to stay and to take a role in the rebuilding?" He looked up. "Director of Emergency Medicine. Full clinical authority, department budget authority, seat at the leadership table. The position comes with the expectation that you'd use it to do exactly what you've been doing without authorization for 3 years. She'd looked at him for a long moment. "You're asking me to run the department the way Voss should have run it. I'm asking you to run it the way you would run it," he said. "I think those are different things." She'd told him she'd think about it. She'd taken 3 days. Then she'd said yes. The first thing she did as director of emergency medicine was convene a meeting of the department's nursing staff. Not a memo, not an email. A meeting in the break room with chairs arranged without hierarchy and without a presentation, just her standing in front of the people she'd worked beside for 3 years as an invisible night shift nurse. She told them the complaint suppression was documented. She told them that the 2 buried complaints from Park and from Odom were officially part of the hospital's corrective review. She told them that the new structure of the department would have an independent oversight mechanism for concerns about clinical conduct that would not route through the department head. She'd told them, and this was the part she hadn't planned to say, but said anyway, because it was true, that she was aware she'd been invisible to most of them for 3 years, and that she'd chosen that, and that she wasn't asking for retrospective acknowledgement of what she'd been or done during that time. "I'm not interested in what I was," she said. "I'm interested in what this department becomes, and I can't build that without the people in this room." Sandra from the nurses' station had said, after a pause, "What do you need from us?" "Honesty," Claire said. "When something is wrong, say so. Specifically, to me, in writing, if necessary. I will not bury it." It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a moment. It was a statement of operating expectations delivered in a break room to a group of tired people on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. And it was received the way genuine things usually are, without applause, with nods, with the quiet of people deciding whether to believe it and beginning, tentatively, to. Marcia's situation resolved in month 4. The KIA designation was formally rescinded following a review process that Morales had described to Claire as, quote, more bureaucratically painful than the actual investigation. The rescission was accompanied by a reinstatement of Marcia's service record, back pay calculated from her original separation date, and a formal acknowledgement from the Army that the designation had been issued on the basis of information that was, at minimum, incomplete. The acknowledgement didn't use the word falsified. Marsh had noted this without surprise. They never used that word for themselves, she told Claire. They were sitting in Claire's apartment, eating takeout that had arrived lukewarm because they'd been talking when it came, and neither of them had stopped to open it immediately. But it's in the record now. All of it. My service, the Hamal debrief, the complaint, She paused. The 4 years. It's all in the record. What are you going to do? Claire said. I've been asked to consult with the IG's office, Marsh said, on the Fenn investigation and potentially on a broader review of similar case closures. She looked at her food. It's the most official thing I've done in 4 years. The paperwork alone is going to be surreal. Will you take it? Yes. She said it without hesitation, which meant she'd already decided. I spent 4 years running from a record. I'd like to spend some time building one. She looked up. What about you? Are you actually going to stay in Wyoming? I live here, Claire said. You landed here, Marsh said. There's a difference. Claire thought about the ridge trail behind the water tower, the window that faced the mountains, the crash cart she'd reorganized without being asked. 3 years of overnight shifts in a building where nobody knew what she was. I chose to stay, she said. That's also different. Marsh looked at her for a long moment. She seemed to be checking something, the way you check a compass reading when you're not sure the terrain matches the map. Then she nodded. Okay, she said. The dog helps, Claire said. Marsh looked at Maverick, who was on the floor near the window with his chin on his forepaws and one eye partially open in the way of a dog that is nominally resting and actually monitoring. He always did, Marsh said. Fenn's trial began in month 5 and ran for 3 weeks. Claire testified on the second day. She sat in the witness chair and answered questions for 4 hours, with the same quality of attention she brought to a crash cart inventory, thorough, specific, without ornament. She said what she'd seen and done and known and when. She said the name of the operation and the date and the specific sequence of decisions that had led to the deaths of 2 personnel and the endangerment of the rest. She said the name of the person who had ordered the debrief suppression and the name of the person who had signed off on the KIA designation, and she said both names without her voice changing because she'd been carrying both names for 4 years and they had lost the power to affect her larynx. The prosecutor asked near the end, Sergeant Navarro, why did you wait 4 years to come forward? She looked at the question for a moment before answering. I didn't wait, she said. I filed a complaint in 2019. It was suppressed. I didn't have the evidence to overcome the suppression. Staff Sergeant Rourke spent 2 years building that evidence. When it was ready, I moved. Why didn't you contact federal authorities independently? Because without corroborating documentation, my testimony was one person's account against an official record that had been altered to contradict it. She paused. I made a calculation. It turned out to be right. I'm aware it could have gone the other way. The prosecutor nodded and moved on. Fenn was convicted on all 3 counts. The sentencing was 3 months after the verdict, 14 years, federal facility. The sentence was reported in the regional news and in several national outlets that covered it with the specific tone of stories about institutional failure. Not outrage exactly, because the events were too distant and too inside a world most readers didn't have access to, but the tone of people recording something that happened and that should not have. Voss's criminal trial was separate and came 6 weeks later. His charges carried a different weight. The patient record falsification was the most publicly comprehensible of them, and the coverage of it was more immediate and angrier because it connected to something people understood without needing context. A doctor had altered records to protect himself from accountability for a patient outcome, and had done it in a hospital where he'd been running the complaints process for 11 years. His medical license was permanently revoked 3 days into the trial, before the verdict, because the board had determined that the ongoing proceedings had surfaced sufficient additional evidence to move from suspension to revocation without waiting for the criminal outcome. The verdict came on a Thursday. Guilty on 4 counts. Sentencing, 9 years state facility, with a federal sentence running concurrently on the obstruction charge. Claire was not in the courtroom for the sentencing. She was in the emergency department at Cascade Valley Medical Center, where she had a full shift and 3 ongoing cases and a 4th-year resident named Osei, who was 6 weeks into a rotation under her supervision and who was, she had decided, going to be a very good physician if someone spent enough time teaching him to trust what he was seeing. She found out about the sentencing from a text from Dre at 4:17 p.m. It's done. 9 years, license gone permanently. She read it at the nurse's station between patient updates. She put her phone back in her pocket. She went back to the case she'd been reviewing. Sandra, at the desk 3 feet away, had seen her read the message. She didn't say anything, but she caught Claire's eye for a half-second, and the expression on her face was the expression of a person who understands what has just been communicated without needing to know the specific words. Claire nodded once. Sandra nodded back. That was the whole of it. The ceremony came 2 months after the sentencing, and Claire had tried to prevent it. She'd told Dre it was unnecessary. She'd told Bolin the same. She'd lost the argument on both fronts, separately, within the same week, which she attributed to the fact that she was apparently less persuasive about things that were about her than about things that were about other people. It was held at Cascade Valley Medical Center, in the main atrium, on a Saturday morning in early spring when the mountain light came through the glass in long, flat angles and made everything look more significant than it probably was. The hospital staff was there. Nursing, physician, administrative, support staff, people who'd worked under Voss for years, and people who'd arrived after, all of them present in the specific way people are present when they understand that they are witnessing something that marks a change. Dre was there in uniform. Torres was there, her arm no longer in a sling. Waverly was there, technically discharged from the Army 3 months prior on medical grounds, showing up anyway because he'd told Claire in a phone call that he wasn't going to miss it, and she hadn't been able to convince him otherwise. Pittman was there on crutches, still working through the recovery from the tibial repair, with a patience that surprised her given how badly he'd handled the immediate aftermath of the surgery. Marsh was there. She'd driven up from Denver where she'd relocated to begin the IG consulting work. She was in civilian clothes because her service reinstatement was still technically in process, and she stood near the back of the atrium and watched with an expression that was complicated and real in all the ways expressions are when the thing you're watching has cost enough. Park was there. She'd stayed at Cascade Valley, had in fact been offered and accepted a senior attending role in the department restructuring, which had been Claire's recommendation to Boland, and which had been, she thought, the right one, because Park was a good doctor who had made a compromised choice under pressure and who was spending the consequential part of her career making different choices. Boland gave a short statement that was more honest than she'd expected from him, which she took as evidence that people could change when the conditions around them changed. Then it was her turn. She stood at the front of the atrium with Maverick at her left side. He had been, by general consensus of the staff and by Boland's specific approval, granted a sort of informal permanent status as departmental presence, which was irregular, and which she'd decided to treat as settled fact before anyone thought too hard about it. And she looked at the room. The Army had sent a representative, a colonel she'd met once before, who presented the award with the specific formal brevity of military ceremony. A commendation medal for extraordinary service in combat conditions during the Hamal operation, issued belatedly and without the usual language about timeliness because there was no good language for why it had taken 5 years. She received it with both hands. She looked at it for a moment. The physical object of it, the medal and the ribbon, the fact that it was here and she was here and the room was full of people who knew, now, the weight behind it. Then she set it on the table beside her because she needed her hands free for what she wanted to say. She hadn't written anything down. She'd decided not to, because the things she wanted to say weren't the kinds of things that improved on paper. They were the kinds of things that either came out honestly in the moment or not at all. I spent a long time being quiet, she said. The atrium had good acoustics. Her voice carried without effort. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't quiet because I was weak. I was quiet because I was calculating the cost of being loud and determining that I didn't yet have enough to make the noise matter. Those are different things. It took me a while to understand the difference myself. She looked at the room, at Torres, who was sitting very straight, at Waverly, who was watching her with the direct attention of someone who had learned to pay attention to this person specifically, at Park, who was looking at her hands. People in institutions get told a version of this story all the time, she said. The version where the lesson is, stay in your lane, follow the chain, trust the system. And sometimes those are right. Chains of command exist for reasons. Protocols exist for reasons. I know that. She paused. But systems are built by people, and people who build systems sometimes build them to protect themselves. And when that happens, when the protocol is actually a wall, when the chain of command is actually a leash, the question becomes whether you trust the structure or whether you trust what you can see with your own eyes. The room was very quiet. I trusted what I could see, she said. It cost me some things. It also kept people alive, and eventually it produced a different kind of accounting than the one I was told to expect. She looked at Maverick, who was sitting beside her with his amber eyes pointed at the room. I'm not standing here to tell you to be reckless. I'm standing here because a man named Daniel Rourke spent 2 years doing careful, patient, unglamorous work to make this moment possible, and he didn't live to be in it. And the least I can do with the thing he built is say out loud what it actually cost. She picked the metal back up, held it. The institutions we're part of are worth fighting for, she said, not because they're always right. They're not. But because the people inside them are worth the fight. That's the only reason I'm standing in this room instead of somewhere quieter. She looked at the staff around her, at the nurses who'd watched her reorganize crash carts in the middle of the night, at the residents she was now teaching, at Sandra at the edge of the crowd who was doing the thing she did where she wasn't going to cry but was making the face that preceded it. I'm done being small. And I'd like it if you weren't either. That was the whole speech. The applause was not the kind that comes from obligation. It was the kind that comes from recognition, from people hearing something true and responding to the specific frequency of it. It was not neat or synchronized. Some people started before others. Someone in the back, she thought it was Waverly, did a single sharp whistle that made several people laugh. She didn't cry. She hadn't expected to. But when Marsh crossed the room to her afterward and stood in front of her without saying anything immediately, just looking at her with the specific look of a person who has known you in a previous life and is seeing you now in this one and finding the distance between the two versions strange and also not so large as expected. When Marsh stood there like that, Claire felt something give way in her chest, quietly, without drama. He would have been annoying about this, Marsh said, about Rourke. He would have made a whole thing about being right. He would have been unbearable, Claire agreed. Yeah. Marsh's jaw worked briefly. I kind of would have given anything. I know, Claire said. They stood together for a moment in the spring light of the atrium, with the room moving and talking around them, and the metal in Claire's hand and Maverick pressed against her left leg, solid and present, and certain in the way of a creature that has found the person it was looking for and does not intend to lose them again. 3 years ago, she'd walked through this atrium on her first day. She'd introduced herself to the charge nurse with 2 sentences. She'd asked for the overnight shift. She'd been trying to become someone who took up less space. She was done with that. The hard thing about spending years making yourself invisible is that it works. People stop seeing you. They stop accounting for you. They build their structures around your absence, and the structures grow solid, and then one day the invisible thing turns out to be the load-bearing wall, and everything they built assuming you weren't there has to be rebuilt around the fact of you. She had not been trying to be a load-bearing wall. She'd been trying to survive a difficult period while doing the most good she could with what she had available. That was all. It was not a heroic intention. It was a practical one, the same intention she'd carried into the field years ago, and through the hospital corridors and up the stairwell with a clipboard and a penlight and the sustained refusal to let the machinery fail on her watch. She was still that person. She was also now the person who ran the department, the person whose name was on the door, the person who sat at the leadership table and said what she could see out loud to the people who needed to hear it. Both things were true. She was not going to pretend the weight of the second one was comfortable, because it wasn't, because comfort was not the point. The point was the work. It had always been the work. She put the medal in her jacket pocket and turned back toward the emergency department. Because she had a shift in 4 hours and Ose needed supervision on a case, and the morning was not going to wait for the end of a ceremony. Maverick fell in at her left side. The atrium was warm and full of people and light, and she walked through it without looking for exits, without measuring the space she was allowed to occupy, without making herself smaller than she was. She walked through it like someone who had earned the right to take up exactly as much room as she needed, and who had finally, after a very long time, decided to use it.